Death had been chasing Tasha Ertel through the rain for 27 miles, and she could feel it gaining ground with every lightning strike that split the sky. The storm had transformed the highway into a river of black glass, her ancient Honda hydroplaning through puddles that seemed to devour the road whole. She should have pulled over miles ago, should have rescheduled the interview, should have heeded the weather warnings crackling through her radio. But desperation had a way of making dangerous decisions feel like the only ones left. "Please," she whispered to the storm, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. "Just let me get there." The appointment letter lay beside her on the passenger seat, its edges damp from the humidity that seeped through her car's failing seals. Senior graphic designer at Stockard Technologies. The position that could finally lift her out of the suffocating poverty that had defined her entire 28 years. The chance to work for Charles Stockard himself, the brilliant, mysterious billionaire who had revolutionized digital design across 3 continents. Thunder rolled overhead like the voice of an angry god, and Tasha pressed harder on the accelerator. 65 miles per hour in these conditions was suicide, but the interview was in 30 minutes, and she'd already rescheduled twice. This was her last chance, her only chance. Her portfolio sat in the back seat, 5 years of her best work protected in a waterproof case. Nights spent hunched over her laptop in her cramped studio apartment, surviving on ramen and dreams. Designs that had won small contests, caught the attention of a few local businesses, but never the big break she needed. Never the opportunity to prove she was more than just another struggling artist from the wrong side of town. The radio crackled with static. Severe thunderstorm warning in effect. Drivers advised to seek shelter immediately. Conditions extremely dangerous. But Tasha couldn't seek shelter. Not when she was this close to changing everything. Not when Charles Stockard, the man whose company had been her inspiration since art school, was waiting to meet her. The 18-wheeler materialized from the storm like a steel leviathan, its headlights cutting through the rain in twin beams of approaching doom. Tasha's heart stopped as she realized the massive truck was drifting into her lane. The driver probably blinded by the same torrential downpour that had turned the world into liquid chaos. Time crystallized into brutal slow motion. She wrenched the wheel hard to the right, feeling her car lose all traction on the flooded asphalt. The Honda spun like a child's toy, the world outside her windows becoming a nauseating blur of grey sky and black road, and the silver flash of the guardrail rushing toward her with inevitable finality. In that last moment before impact, as her life hung suspended between heartbeats, Tasha thought about all the things she'd never have the chance to do. She'd never see her name in the credits of a major campaign. Never prove to her older brother Bryce that she was more than just a dreamer. Never find the kind of love that made poets write sonnets and made ordinary people believe in magic. The collision was thunder made manifest. Metal screamed against metal as her car crumpled like paper, the guardrail tearing through the driver's side with the sound of the world shattering. Glass exploded inward, painting the air with glittering fragments that caught the lightning's violent glow. Pain bloomed across her skull like a crimson flower opening to impossible light. And then, darkness. When consciousness returned, it came in broken pieces, the acrid smell of smoke and twisted metal, rain pattering against what remained of her windshield, sirens wailing in the distance like mourning banshees, and voices, so many voices, talking over each other in urgent professional tones that seemed to come from underwater. Severe head trauma, possible skull fracture. Need to get her out of here now. Amazing she's still breathing. Tasha tried to open her eyes, but even that simple act sent spikes of agony through her skull. Her portfolio case lay open beside her, its contents scattered and ruined, her dreams literally bleeding into the rain-soaked highway. The appointment letter was gone, probably swept away by the storm that had destroyed everything. "Can you hear me?" A paramedic's voice cut through the chaos, gentle but insistent. "Miss, can you tell me your name?" She tried to speak, but her throat felt like it was full of broken glass. The taste of copper filled her mouth. Blood, she realized with detached horror. Instead of speaking, she managed the tiniest nod, which sent fresh waves of pain cascading through her head like an avalanche of agony. Strong hands lifted her from the wreckage, and through her barely open eyes, she caught a glimpse of her car. It was completely destroyed, nothing left but twisted metal and shattered dreams. The entire driver's side had been crushed, the roof partially caved in. By all rights, she should have been dead. "Stay with me," the paramedic said as they loaded her into the ambulance. "You're going to be okay. You're a fighter, I can tell." As the ambulance raced through the storm toward the hospital, Tasha's last coherent thought was about the interview she'd never make. Charles Stockard would be sitting in his pristine office tomorrow, waiting for a candidate who would never arrive. He'd probably forget her name within hours, just another disappointed applicant in a city full of them. The ambulance doors slammed shut, and as they fought through the storm, Tasha Ertel had no way of knowing that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The accident that had destroyed her dreams would soon give her something far more powerful and far more dangerous than she'd ever dared to hope for. In the emergency room, as trauma surgeons worked frantically to save her life, something fundamental shifted in the delicate architecture of her brain. The impact had caused severe swelling and microhemorrhages in regions that controlled perception and consciousness. The medical team worked to relieve the pressure, but the damage had already triggered an unprecedented neurological response. The blow to her head had caused what doctors would later classify as a moderate traumatic brain injury, with contusions scattered across her frontal and temporal lobes. The swelling pressed against neural pathways, but instead of simply destroying tissue, her brain began an extraordinary process of adaptive rewiring. Her brain was remarkably adaptable, finding ways to reroute neural connections around the damaged areas. But in this case, the rewiring was creating something that had never been documented in medical literature. Synapses formed new connections across previously separated regions. Neural networks built bridges between consciousness and areas of the brain typically dormant in humans. And in the space between heartbeats, between the steady beep of monitors and the urgent whispers of medical staff, between the thunder and the lightning that still raged outside, Tasha's mind was quietly rebuilding itself. The accident had opened doorways in her consciousness that were never meant to be opened, creating pathways that would soon allow her to hear the thoughts of everyone around her. As the surgeons worked to reduce the swelling in her brain, as her brother Bryce raced through the storm to reach her side, as the rain finally began to slow outside the hospital windows, Tasha's mind was quietly rebuilding itself. The accident had opened doorways in her consciousness that were never meant to be opened, creating pathways that would soon allow her to hear the thoughts of everyone around her. The woman who had driven through the storm to chase her dreams was gone forever. In her place would wake someone with a gift both miraculous and terrifying, the ability to read minds, and with that power would come a love story that would reshape both their lives, beginning with a billionaire whose heart was as guarded as his empire was vast. But first, she had to survive the night. The monitors beeped steadily as her brain fought to heal itself, creating new neural pathways that would change everything. Outside, the storm was finally passing, leaving behind a world washed clean and full of impossible new possibilities. Chapter 2. The Fortress of Ice and Steel. Charles Stockard stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, 40 stories above the city that had made him one of the youngest billionaires in the world, and felt absolutely nothing. The storm that had raged through the night was finally clearing, leaving behind a washed-clean metropolis that sparkled with deceptive beauty in the morning sun. From this height, everything looked perfect, orderly, manageable. A stark contrast to the chaos consuming his thoughts since 3 o'clock that morning when he'd abandoned all hope of sleep. At 38, Charles had built an empire that spanned 3 continents, revolutionized digital design, and commanded respect from competitors who feared even mentioning his name. Stockard Technologies was his masterpiece, a testament to vision and ruthless determination. But standing here in his pristine office, surrounded by awards and accolades that meant nothing to him, he felt like he was suffocating behind glass walls of his own making. "Mr. Stockard?" His assistant's voice came through the intercom, professional and carefully neutral. Lyra Westmere had worked for him for 8 years, and she'd learned to read his moods like weather patterns. "The candidate for the senior graphic designer position hasn't arrived yet. Her interview was scheduled for 10 o'clock. Should I reschedule?" Charles glanced at his watch. 10:15 a.m. He'd been looking forward to this interview more than he cared to admit, though he'd never show it. Her portfolio had been remarkable, not just technically proficient, but infused with an emotional depth that had made him stop and stare at his computer screen for a full 5 minutes when he'd first seen her work. There was something about her designs that spoke to the part of him he'd thought was dead. A vulnerability wrapped in strength, a hope that refused to be crushed despite obvious financial limitations. Her submission had been printed on inferior paper, her presentation folder held together with tape, but her talent blazed through every line and curve like sunlight through storm clouds. "Give her another 30 minutes, he said, his voice carrying the authority that made board members tremble. "The weather was terrible last night." "Of course, sir." But Charles already knew she wouldn't come. Something in his chest had been tight since he'd woken up, a feeling he'd learned to recognize as his instinct, warning him that something was wrong. He'd built his fortune on that instinct, and it had never failed him in business. He turned back to the window, watching the city come alive below. Traffic moved in orderly streams, people hurried along sidewalks with purpose, life continued its relentless forward march. None of them knew about the man watching from his tower, isolated by wealth and power and the ghosts of everyone who had betrayed him. The intercom buzzed again. "Mr. Stockard, I'm sorry to disturb you, but I have news about Ms. Ertel." Charles's entire body went rigid. "What kind of news?" "She was in a car accident last night during the storm. She's at Metropolitan Hospital. I'm afraid it's quite serious." The world tilted sideways. Charles gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white against the dark wood. "How serious?" "Head trauma. She's in intensive care." "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Clear my schedule for the rest of the day." "Sir, I'm not sure." "Clear it, Lyra." He was already moving, grabbing his jacket from the back of his chair, his mind racing through possibilities and connections. Metropolitan Hospital was where his company had donated millions for their new trauma wing. Dr. Marcus Chen, the chief of neurosurgery, owed him favors. He could make calls, ensure she had the best care, make sure. Charles stopped dead in the middle of his office. Why did he care? He'd never even met Tasha Ertel. She was just another job candidate, one of hundreds who'd applied for the position. The logical thing to do was to express polite concern and move on to the next candidate. But logic had abandoned him the moment he'd seen her work. There was something about her art that had reached past all his carefully constructed defenses and touched something he'd thought was beyond reach. Her designs didn't just communicate information, they communicated emotion, hope, the kind of raw human truth that he'd spent years running from. The elevator ride to the parking garage felt like an eternity. His hands were shaking as he slid behind the wheel of his Aston Martin, a tremor he hadn't experienced since the night his parents had died in a car accident 15 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on him. Another car accident, another person he cared about more than he should, another chance for life to remind him that caring about people only led to pain. He'd been 23 when his parents died, newly graduated from MIT with a computer science degree and dreams of changing the world. Their deaths had shattered something fundamental inside him, but had also crystallized his determination. He'd built Stockard Technologies from nothing, driven by a fury that had sustained him through 18-hour days and cutthroat competition. Success had come faster than anyone predicted. By 25, he was worth $50 million. By 30, he'd broken the billion-dollar mark. By 35, he was considered one of the most influential tech moguls in the world. But with each milestone, each victory, he'd felt himself growing colder, more isolated, more convinced that human connections were luxuries he couldn't afford. The hospital came into view, its modern glass facade gleaming in the morning sun. Charles parked in the visitors' area and strode through the main entrance with the confidence of a man who owned the world. The staff recognized him immediately. His substantial donations had funded the new trauma wing and much of the equipment in the building. Mr. Stockard, Dr. Caspian Blackthorne approached him with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I wasn't expecting you today." "Tasha Ertel," Charles said without preamble. "She was brought in last night. Head trauma." Dr. Blackthorne's expression grew serious. "Are you family?" "I'm her employer," Charles said smoothly. "She was driving to an interview with my company when the accident occurred. I feel responsible for her condition." "She's stable, but it was touch and go for a while. Moderate traumatic brain injury, significant swelling. We've had to induce a coma to give her brain time to heal." Charles felt something crack inside his chest. "Will she recover?" "It's too early to tell. Brain injuries are unpredictable. She could wake up in a few days with minimal effects, or there could be lasting complications." Dr. Blackthorne's voice carried the weight of years of experience with such cases. "Or she could be changed forever," Charles finished. "Every brain injury is different, Mr. Stockard. We're doing everything we can." Charles nodded, his face a mask of professional concern. But inside, his chest felt tight with an emotion he couldn't name. A woman whose only connection to him was a portfolio of extraordinary art was lying unconscious 2 floors above him, and he felt like his world was shifting on its axis. "I want her moved to a private room," he said. "The best available. I'll cover all expenses." "Mr. Stockard, that's very generous, but not generous. Necessary." His voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "She was injured while traveling to work for my company. She deserves the best care available." "Of course, sir." As Dr. Blackthorne walked away to make arrangements, Charles found himself alone in the hospital corridor, surrounded by the antiseptic smell of medical equipment and the distant sound of machines keeping people alive. He'd stood in corridors like this before, 15 years ago, when his parents had been dying and he'd been powerless to save them. He couldn't explain why Tasha Ertel mattered to him. He'd never spoken to her, never seen her face, knew nothing about her life except what he could glean from her portfolio. But something about her work had awakened feelings he'd thought were dead and buried. Her design spoke of resilience, of beauty found in broken places, of hope that refused to be extinguished. Maybe that was what he recognized in her art, the reflection of his own broken places, the parts of himself he'd hidden away behind walls of money and power and carefully controlled isolation. Maybe she was the first person in 15 years who had created something that made him feel human again. Charles walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the intensive care unit. He couldn't explain why he needed to see her, why he felt responsible for her recovery, why the thought of her suffering made his chest feel like it was being crushed by invisible hands. All he knew was that Tasha Ertel had been coming to see him when the accident happened. She'd been driving through that storm to meet him, to show him her work, to ask for a chance to prove herself. And now she was lying unconscious, fighting for her life. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Charles stepped inside, his reflection ghost-like in the polished steel walls. He was about to meet the woman whose art had touched his soul, and she would never know he was there, but he would know. And for the first time in 15 years, Charles Stockard was going to let himself care about someone else's pain more than his own protection. The woman who could read minds was about to meet the man whose heart was locked away behind walls of ice and steel. Neither of them knew that their love story was about to begin in the most unlikely place possible, a hospital room where dreams hung suspended between life and death, waiting for the moment when two damaged souls would finally find their way to each other. Chapter 3. Echoes of a Broken Mind. The voices came first, whispering through the darkness like ghosts made of sound and sorrow. She won't make it through the night. Poor thing, so young. Head trauma this severe. The family should prepare for the worst. Tasha's consciousness floated in a space between sleeping and waking, between life and death, where thoughts that weren't her own crashed through her mind like waves against broken shores. She couldn't open her eyes, couldn't move, couldn't speak, but somehow she could hear the unspoken fears of everyone around her with crystalline clarity. Dr. Blackthorne, room 314 needs you immediately. The voice belonged to a nurse whose name was Janet, though Tasha had no idea how she knew that. Janet was worried about her youngest daughter's fever, wondering if she should call in sick tomorrow to stay home with her. The knowledge simply existed in Tasha's mind, as clear and undeniable as her own memories. This is impossible, she thought, panic rising in her chest. I'm hallucinating. Brain damage. Has to be brain damage. But the voices kept coming, a symphony of human consciousness that she couldn't silence. Wonder if she has insurance. These bills are going to destroy her family. Third car accident this week. This weather is getting worse every year. She's pretty, even with all the bandages. Shame if she doesn't wake up. The last thought came from someone standing very close to her bed, and with it came a sudden, overwhelming urge to open her eyes. Tasha fought against the medical sedation, against the pain that felt like lightning trapped inside her skull, against the impossibility of what was happening to her. Light. Blinding, antiseptic light that made her head feel like it was splitting in two. But through the agony, she could see a figure standing beside her bed. A tall man in a white coat, whose thoughts were radiating concern and professional curiosity. Miss Ertel? Can you hear me? The man's voice was kind, accented with what sounded like a slight British inflection. His name was Dr. Caspian Blackthorne, and he was thinking about neural pathways and unprecedented brain activity patterns and how her case might revolutionize neurological understanding. Remarkable. The EEG readings are unlike anything I've seen in 30 years of practice. Increased activity in the temporal and parietal lobes, almost as if new neural networks are forming in real time. I can hear you, Tasha whispered, her voice coming out as barely more than a croak. All of you. Dr. Blackthorne's eyebrows rose. I'm sorry, what did you say? Your thoughts. The words felt foreign in her mouth, impossible even as she spoke them. You're thinking about my brain scans, about how unusual they are, about how this might change neurological understanding. The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Blackthorne's thoughts went completely quiet, as if he'd just slammed mental doors shut. But Tasha could still sense his presence, still feel the shock radiating from him like heat from a fire. Miss Ertel, he said carefully, you've suffered a severe traumatic brain injury. Hallucinations and confusion are normal parts of the healing process. You need to rest. Janet is worried about her daughter Emma's fever, Tasha said, her voice growing stronger despite the pain. She's wondering if she should call in sick tomorrow. And you're thinking that what just happened is impossible. But you can't explain how I knew about your thoughts regarding my EEG patterns. Dr. Blackthorne went completely still. Through the haze of her new and terrifying ability, Tasha could sense his mind racing, trying to find rational explanations for what was happening. This is impossible. She couldn't have overheard. The EEG results weren't discussed anywhere near her room. But how else could she? The accident, she whispered, understanding beginning to dawn. Something happened to my brain during the accident. Brain injuries can cause many unusual symptoms, Dr. Blackthorne said, but his clinical tone couldn't hide his fascination. We need to run more tests, understand exactly what's happening to you. More tests? Tasha tried to sit up, but the movement sent waves of agony through her skull. Doctor, I can hear people's thoughts. I can hear your thoughts. How is that possible? Before Dr. Blackthorne could answer, the door to her room opened and a woman entered. She was tall and elegant, with silver hair and eyes that held decades of wisdom. Behind her came a man whose presence seemed to fill the room, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair, and the kind of face that belonged on magazine covers. He's been here for hours, won't leave, keeps asking about her condition. I've never seen him show such concern for anyone. The woman, a senior nurse named Margaret, was thinking about the man, about how unusual it was for him to show such concern for a patient. But the man's thoughts were locked away behind walls so thick that Tasha couldn't penetrate them. All she could sense from him was an overwhelming intensity, a focus so sharp it made her breath catch. Charles, Dr. Blackthorne said, and Tasha's heart stopped. Charles Stockard, the man she'd been driving to meet, the billionaire whose company had been her dream job, whose empire she'd admired from afar. He was here, in her hospital room, and his presence was like a magnetic force that drew her attention completely. How is she? Charles asked, his voice deep and carefully controlled. Awake, which is excellent news, Dr. Blackthorne replied, but she's experiencing some unusual symptoms. Hallucinations, possibly. Not hallucinations, Tasha said, her eyes fixed on Charles. I can hear thoughts. I can hear everyone's thoughts except... She paused, staring at him. Except yours. Charles's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his dark eyes. I'm sorry about your accident, Miss Ertel. I'm Charles Stockard. You were coming to interview with my company. I know who you are. Tasha's voice was barely a whisper. You're the man whose work inspired me to become a designer. You're the reason I was driving through that storm. She's even more beautiful than I imagined. But this talk about reading minds, the accident must have affected her more severely than we thought. The thought came from the older woman, and Tasha turned to look at her. You're thinking I'm beautiful, but that the accident affected me more than anyone realizes. The woman's face went pale. I didn't say anything. You didn't have to, Tasha said, her voice growing stronger as the reality of her situation began to sink in. I can hear your thoughts. I can hear everyone's thoughts, except his. She looked back at Charles. Your mind is completely silent to me. Charles stepped closer to her bed, his movements careful and controlled. Miss Ertel, you've been through a terrible trauma. Your brain is trying to process. My brain is processing thoughts that aren't mine, Tasha interrupted. The nurse outside is thinking about her grocery list. The patient in the next room is worried about his medical bills. The janitor in the hallway is humming a song about lost love. I can hear all of them, but I can't hear you. The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility and fear. Dr. Blackthorne was frantically trying to rationalize what he was hearing, while the older woman was torn between skepticism and wonder. But Charles remained an enigma, his thoughts locked away behind barriers that even her new ability couldn't penetrate. There's something else, Tasha said, her voice dropping to a whisper. When I try to reach into your mind, I feel warmth. Like there's something there that's meant for me, but it's hidden behind walls. Charles's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Miss Ertel. Tasha, she corrected. And I know this sounds impossible. I know you all think I'm hallucinating or delusional, but I'm not. Something happened to me in that accident, something that changed the way my brain works. I can hear thoughts now, and yours are the only ones I can't access. Dr. Blackthorne pulled out his phone and began making notes. This is unprecedented. If what you're saying is true, we need to understand how this is possible, what areas of your brain were affected, whether this is temporary or permanent. It's permanent, Tasha said with sudden certainty. I can feel it. The connections in my brain have changed. They've rewired themselves in ways that shouldn't be possible. The human brain is remarkably adaptable, Dr. Blackthorne said, his scientific mind racing. After trauma, neurons can form new pathways, create connections that didn't exist before. But telepathic abilities, that's beyond anything documented in medical literature. Maybe, Charles said quietly, we should focus on helping Miss Ertel recover rather than treating her like a laboratory experiment. His words were gentle, but Tasha could sense the protective instinct behind them. Even though she couldn't read his thoughts, she could feel his concern for her well-being, his desire to shield her from further harm. You care about me, she said, studying his face, but I don't understand why. You don't even know me. I know your work, Charles replied. I know the person who created those designs. Someone with that much talent, that much heart. They deserve to be protected. For the first time since waking up, Tasha smiled. You looked at my portfolio. I've looked at it dozens of times, Charles admitted. Your designs are extraordinary. They speak to something deeper than just visual appeal. They speak to the soul. As they worked together, Tasha found herself drawn to Charles in ways that had nothing to do with her abilities. His intelligence, his passion for innovation, his unexpected kindness to his employees. She began to see the man behind the billionaire facade. You're different than I expected, she said one afternoon as they reviewed campaign concepts in his office. How so? Charles asked, looking up from the designs spread across his desk. More human, I suppose. The media portrays you as this cold, calculating businessman, but you're not like that at all. Maybe you're seeing the person I used to be, Charles said quietly, before I learned that caring about people was dangerous. What happened to make you think that? Charles was quiet for a long moment. I lost my parents when I was 23. Car accident. After that, I decided it was safer to keep people at a distance. Until you. Until me. Until I saw your work and realized that some things, some people, are worth the risk of caring. The vulnerability in his voice made her heart ache. Charles, don't, he said quickly. Don't say anything you might regret. I know this situation is complicated. I know I've put you in an impossible position. Just let me be grateful that you're here, that you're safe, that I finally have a chance to know you. Tasha felt tears prick her eyes. You're not putting me in an impossible position. You're giving me a chance to know you too. And what do you think so far? He asked, his voice carefully neutral. I think, she said slowly, that I'm starting to understand why my mind finds peace in yours. You're not just quiet to me. You're sanctuary. The promise in his voice made something deep in Tasha's chest flutter with hope. She didn't understand why this powerful, wealthy man cared about her recovery, why he was willing to stay by her side through something as strange and frightening as this. But his presence was the only thing that made her feel safe in a world where everyone's thoughts crashed through her mind like breaking waves. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me yet, Charles said, and for the first time, She thought she detected a hint of vulnerability in his voice. "This is just the beginning. We need to get you well, help you understand what's happening to you, and then we figure out what comes next, together." The word "together" hung in the air between them, full of possibility and promise. Tasha couldn't read his thoughts, couldn't understand why he was willing to stay, but she could feel the sincerity in his voice, the strength in his presence. For the first time since the accident, she began to hope that maybe, just maybe, her new and terrifying abilities might lead to something beautiful after all. Chapter 4. The Billionaire's Secret Pain. The silence in Charles Stockard's mind was not empty. It was full of carefully constructed walls, each one built from 15 years of pain, betrayal, and the kind of loss that changes a soul forever. As he sat in the chair beside Tasha's hospital bed, watching her sleep peacefully for the first time since the accident, Charles allowed himself to remember the night that had transformed him from an idealistic young man into the fortress of ice and steel she'd described. The night he'd learned that loving someone was the most dangerous thing a person could do. 3 years ago, Charles had been reviewing portfolios for a design competition his company sponsored when her submission had stopped him cold. The artwork was extraordinary, not just technically brilliant, but infused with an emotional depth that spoke directly to his soul. He'd spent hours studying each piece, captivated by the way she captured hope and vulnerability in perfect harmony. Tasha Ertel. He'd memorized the name, then found himself researching her work, her background, her struggles as an artist trying to make it in an unforgiving industry. What had started as professional admiration had gradually become something deeper, a connection he couldn't explain to someone he'd never met. He'd been drawn to her authenticity in a world full of pretense, her determination to create meaningful art despite financial hardship. Through her work, he'd glimpsed a kindred spirit, someone who understood that success meant nothing without purpose. Charles had begun quietly ensuring her work reached the right people, not through direct interference, but through strategic recommendations, making sure her submissions weren't overlooked, that her talent was given fair consideration. He'd told himself he was simply recognizing exceptional ability, but the truth was more complex. She represented everything he'd lost in his climb to success: passion, hope, the belief that art could change the world. Through her work, he'd found pieces of himself he'd thought were gone forever. When he'd learned about her financial struggles, he'd created a small grant program specifically for emerging artists, ensuring she qualified. When her landlord had threatened eviction, he'd anonymously covered her rent through a charitable foundation. He'd been careful to maintain distance, to never cross the line from admirer to stalker. For 3 years, Charles had wrestled with feelings he couldn't name for a woman he'd never spoken to. He'd convinced himself it was merely artistic appreciation, but seeing her broken and vulnerable in that hospital bed had shattered every lie he'd told himself. The truth was terrifying in its intensity. He was in love with someone who didn't know he existed, and now, for the first time, he had a chance to be more than a shadow in her life. The sound of Tasha stirring in her hospital bed pulled Charles back to the present. She opened her eyes slowly, and he watched as awareness returned to her face. First confusion, then the gradual memory of where she was and what had happened to her. "You're still here," she said, her voice soft with surprise. "I told you I wasn't going anywhere," Charles replied, though he couldn't quite meet her eyes. The weight of his secret love, his 10 years of silent devotion, felt like a burden he couldn't carry much longer. "The voices," Tasha said, sitting up carefully. "They're quieter now. Still there, but manageable." "Doctor," Blackthorne said, "that's normal. Your brain is learning to process the new neural pathways. It should get easier with time. Should. Tasha smiled wryly. That's a word that doesn't inspire confidence when you're talking about impossible abilities. Charles stood and walked to the window, needing distance from the magnetic pull of her presence. Nothing about this situation is normal, Tasha, but that doesn't mean we can't find ways to help you manage it. We? She repeated the word thoughtfully. You keep saying that, but I still don't understand why you're here, why you care about what happens to me. Because I've loved you for 10 years, because I've watched you struggle and triumph and pour your heart into your art. Because the thought of losing you now, when I've finally found the courage to be near you, is more terrifying than anything I've ever faced. But Charles couldn't say any of that. Not yet. Not when she was still recovering, still learning to cope with abilities that defied explanation. Instead, he said, "Your work impressed me. Talent like yours is rare, and I believe in protecting rare things." "Is that all?" Tasha asked, and there was something in her voice that made Charles think she sensed there was more to his answer. "No," he said quietly. "It's not all, but it's all I can tell you right now." Before Tasha could respond, the door to her room opened and a man entered, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of authoritative presence that came from years in law enforcement. His thoughts hit Tasha like a physical blow, and she gasped. "My sister looks terrible. Who is this man? Why is he here? If he's the reason she was out in that storm—" "Bryce," Tasha said, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "You came." "Of course I came," Bryce Thornfield replied, his eyes never leaving Charles. "I've been in Seattle on a case, flew back as soon as I heard about the accident." He stepped closer to the bed, his protective instincts clearly triggered by Charles's presence. "And you are?" "Charles Stockard," Charles said, extending his hand. "I'm the CEO of Stockard Technologies. Your sister was coming to interview with my company when the accident happened." Bryce ignored the offered handshake, his cop instincts clearly on high alert. "And you're here because I feel responsible," Charles said simply. "She was driving through that storm to meet me for an interview. If I hadn't scheduled it during such dangerous weather—" "The storm was an act of nature," Bryce interrupted, his protective instincts clearly triggered. "Accidents happen. That doesn't explain why you're sitting vigil like someone who cares about her well-being," Charles finished quietly. "When I woke up this morning and learned what had happened, I realized I couldn't just send flowers and move on to the next candidate." "Confused about what?" "There's something she's not telling me, something about the way she keeps looking at him, like she's listening to something I can't hear." "What kind of confusion?" Bryce asked, his detective mind clearly picking up on undercurrents in the conversation. Tasha looked at Charles, then back at her brother. "The kind that doesn't make sense to people who haven't experienced it." "Try me," Bryce said, settling into the chair on the other side of her bed. "I've been a cop for 15 years. I've seen things that would make most people question reality." "Have you ever heard thoughts that weren't your own?" Tasha asked quietly. Bryce's expression shifted from concern to worry. "Tasha, honey, you've been through a severe trauma. Hallucinations are not hallucinations," Tasha said firmly. "Right now, you're thinking that I'm having some kind of breakdown. You're worried about my mental state, and you're wondering if the head injury was worse than the doctors told you. You're also suspicious of Charles, wondering why a billionaire would care about your sister, and you're trying to decide if you should have him investigated." The color drained from Bryce's face. "How could you possibly?" "Because I can hear your thoughts," Tasha said simply. "The accident changed something in my brain. I can hear everyone's thoughts now, everyone except his." She looked at Charles, and he felt her attention like a physical touch. "His mind is completely silent to me." Bryce looked back and forth between them, his cop brain trying to process what he was hearing. This is impossible. I know it's impossible, Tasha said, but it's also true. Dr. Blackthorne thinks the trauma created new neural pathways, connections that shouldn't exist. I can hear you right now, wondering if you should call for a psychiatric evaluation. Stop, Bryce said sharply. Stop telling me what I'm thinking. I can't control it, Tasha replied, her voice breaking slightly. I can't turn it off. I can hear every thought, every fear, every secret. It's overwhelming and terrifying, and the only peace I get is when I focus on him because his mind is quiet. Charles felt his heart break at the pain in her voice. Without thinking, he reached out and took her hand, and the moment their skin touched, he watched as peace settled over her features. Better? He asked softly. Much better, she whispered. It's like your presence creates a shield around my mind. I can still hear other people's thoughts, but they're muted, manageable. Bryce was staring at their joined hands with the expression of a man watching his world shift on its axis. This is really happening, isn't it? It's really happening, Tasha confirmed. I wish it weren't, but it is. And you, Bryce said, turning to Charles, you're just accepting this? You believe her? I believe her, Charles said without hesitation. I've seen the way she reacts to people's presence, the way she knows things she couldn't possibly know. Either she's developed genuine telepathic abilities, or she's the most skilled mentalist in history. But you're not affected by it, Bryce said, his detective mind clearly trying to solve the puzzle. She can't read your thoughts. Why not? Charles looked at Tasha, then back at her brother. I don't know. Maybe it's because I've spent so many years building walls around my emotions. Maybe it's because I've trained myself not to broadcast my feelings. Or maybe, he thought, it's because my feelings for her are too deep, too powerful, too dangerous to be revealed through any means other than my own choice. There's something else, Tasha said, her voice thoughtful. When I try to reach into your mind, I don't hit walls. I feel warmth. Like there's something there that's meant for me, but it's being deliberately hidden. Charles felt his carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. Tasha, you've been protecting me, she said suddenly, her eyes widening with realization. Not just since the accident. Before. I can feel it somehow, like an echo of care that's been there for years. You're imagining things, Charles said, but his voice lacked conviction. Am I? Tasha's grip on his hand tightened. The scholarship that appeared out of nowhere when I couldn't afford art school. The mysterious benefactor who paid my rent when I was evicted. The way my work kept getting noticed by people who mattered. That was you, wasn't it? The silence that followed was deafening. Charles felt the weight of 10 years of secrets pressing down on him, the careful barriers he'd built around his heart beginning to crumble. You've been watching over me, Tasha whispered, taking care of me from a distance. Why? Because, Charles said, his voice barely audible. 3 years ago, I saw your work in a design competition submission. Your art spoke to something in me that I thought was dead. I fell in love with your passion, your vision, your incredible talent. And then I made the mistake of learning about the woman behind the art. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable, and completely true. Bryce's sharp intake of breath was audible, but Charles couldn't look away from Tasha's face. Couldn't miss the way her eyes filled with tears. 3 years, she said softly. You've been helping me for 3 years. 3 years, Charles confirmed. From a distance, through intermediaries, making sure your work was seen, that you had opportunities, that your talent was recognized. Never intending to reveal myself, never thinking I deserved to be part of your life. And now, Charles said, bringing their joined hands to his lips and pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Now I can't stay away anymore. The accident, seeing you hurt, realizing I could have lost you forever, it changed everything. Tasha was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she processed the magnitude of what he'd revealed. You love me. I love you, Charles said simply. I've loved you since the moment I saw you light up talking about your art. I've loved you through every piece you've created, every struggle you've faced, every triumph you've achieved. I love your passion, your talent, your unwavering belief that art can heal the world. But you don't know me, Tasha protested. Not really. You've been watching me, but we've never— I know you, Charles interrupted gently. I know that you always buy coffee for the homeless man who sits outside the art supply store. I know that you spend your own money on supplies for art classes at the community center. I know that you cried when you sold your first piece because it meant someone else would love it as much as you did. I know that you work until 3 in the morning when inspiration strikes, and that you hum while you create. I know that you're kind and generous and brave and beautiful, and that you've never let hardship dim your light. How do you know all that? Because I've been in love with you for 10 years, Charles said, his voice filled with a decade's worth of longing. And when you love someone that much, you pay attention to everything about them. Tasha was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he'd told her. Finally, she said, I should be angry. You've been manipulating my life, making decisions for me without my knowledge. You should be angry, Charles agreed. I had no right to interfere, no right to fall in love with you from a distance. I told myself I was protecting you, but really I was protecting myself. I was too afraid of rejection, too afraid of ruining what you might become, to risk approaching you directly. And now I'm still afraid, Charles admitted, but I'm more afraid of losing you. The accident made me realize that life is too short to love someone from the shadows. If you'll let me, I want to be part of your life, really part of it, not as a mysterious benefactor, but as a man who loves you and wants to help you navigate whatever comes next. Tasha looked at him for a long moment, her new abilities apparently unable to penetrate the walls around his mind, but somehow sensing the truth in his words anyway. Finally, she said, I don't know how to process this. The accident, the telepathy, learning that you've loved me for 10 years, it's overwhelming. We don't have to process it all at once, Charles said gently. We have time. Whatever you need, however long it takes, I'll be here. Promise? I promise. And as Charles looked into Tasha's eyes, seeing the beginning of something that might someday become love, he knew that his life had just changed forever. The walls he'd built around his heart were crumbling, and for the first time in 15 years, he wasn't afraid of what that might mean. The woman who could read minds was about to fall in love with the man who had loved her from the shadows. Their story was just beginning, and it would be beautiful and complicated and worth every moment of fear it took to get there. Chapter 5. Dangerous Attraction. 3 weeks later, Tasha stood in the gleaming lobby of Stockard Technologies, her heart racing as she prepared to enter a world she'd only dreamed of joining. Her telepathic abilities had stabilized enough for her to leave the hospital, though she still wore the mental equivalent of armor, techniques Dr. Blackthorne had taught her to filter the constant stream of thoughts. The voices were always there, whispering at the edges of her consciousness, but she'd learned to push them into background noise, except when Charles was near. Then blessed silence. Miss Ertel. Lyra Westmere approached with a warm smile. Mr. Stockard is waiting for you in his office. She's even more beautiful than the photos. No wonder he's been obsessed with her. Hope she's worth the risk he's taking. Tasha winced at the assistant's thoughts, but managed a professional smile. Thank you. The elevator ride to the 40th floor felt eternal. Charles had offered her the senior designer position without an interview, claiming her portfolio spoke for itself. But Tasha suspected his motives were more personal than professional, and the thought both thrilled and terrified her. She couldn't deny the attraction that had sparked between them in the hospital. Every touch of his hand had sent electricity through her veins. Every gentle word had made her heart flutter. But how could she trust feelings that had developed under such extraordinary circumstances? The elevator doors opened to reveal Charles waiting for her, devastatingly handsome in a charcoal suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and commanding presence. The moment she saw him, the chaos in her mind quieted to a whisper. "Tasha." His voice was warm, intimate. "You look beautiful." "Thank you." She smoothed her dress nervously. "I still can't believe you're giving me this opportunity." "You've earned it," Charles said, but his eyes held depths of meaning that went far beyond professional recognition. "Let me show you your office." The space he led her to was spectacular. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, state-of-the-art equipment, and a view that took her breath away. But it was the thoughtful touches that made her heart skip. Fresh flowers on the desk, premium art supplies arranged perfectly, and a framed print of her favorite Van Gogh painting. "You remembered," she whispered, staring at the starry night print. "I remember everything about you," Charles said softly. "How you take your coffee, your favorite colors, the way you hum when you're concentrating. 10 years of watching you work, and I've memorized every detail." The intensity in his voice made her shiver. "Charles, we need to talk about boundaries. I'm grateful for the job, but I can't." "Can't what?" He stepped closer, and she felt the magnetic pull of his presence. "Can't acknowledge what's happening between us." "What's happening is complicated," Tasha said, though her body betrayed her by leaning toward him. "I have abilities I don't understand. You've been in love with me for a decade, and now we're supposed to work together professionally." "Nothing about this is professional," Charles said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It stopped being professional the moment I saw you in that hospital bed." Before she could respond, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The simple touch sent fire through her nerve endings, and she gasped. "You feel it too," he said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. "I feel it," she admitted. "But feeling something doesn't mean we should act on it." "Why not?" "Because you're my boss. Because I don't know if these feelings are real or just a result of trauma and gratitude. Because—" Charles silenced her with a finger against her lips. "Because you're afraid." "Yes," she whispered. "I'm terrified." "So am I," he said, his thumb tracing her lower lip. "I've been afraid for 10 years, afraid of approaching you, afraid of ruining your life, afraid of not being worthy of your love. But I'm more afraid of wasting the chance we have right now." The air between them crackled with tension. Tasha could feel her resolve weakening, could see the hunger in his dark eyes that matched her own. But before either of them could close the distance, her mind suddenly exploded with hostile thoughts. "That's her, the one who's bewitched him. Little schemer thinks she can manipulate the great Charles Stockard." Tasha gasped, pressing her hands to her temples as the venomous thoughts crashed through her consciousness. Charles immediately moved to her side, his presence helping to mute the mental attack. "What is it?" he asked urgently. "Someone's thinking about me," she said through gritted teeth. "Someone who hates me. Someone who's here." The door to her office opened, and a woman entered without knocking. She was stunning, tall, elegant, with platinum blonde hair and ice-blue eyes that held a decade's worth of bitter jealousy. "Ottilie," Charles said, his voice turning cold. "What are you doing here? Look at him protect her. He never defended me like that, but I'll destroy this little nobody and win him back." "I came to meet your new employee," Ottilie Fairchild said, her smile sharp as a blade. I'm Ottilie Fairchild, Charles's former fiancée, and you must be the charity case he's decided to rescue. Ottilie, get out, Charles said, his voice deadly quiet. Oh, but I'm just getting started, Ottilie replied, her attention fixed on Tasha. Did he tell you about us? About how we were going to be married until I realized he was more interested in building his empire than building a life. He's looking at her the way he never looked at me. But she doesn't know about the real Charles, the cold, calculating bastard who destroys anyone who gets in his way. You're lying, Tasha said, the woman's thoughts revealing the truth behind her words. Am I? Ottilie's smile widened. Ask him about the companies he's destroyed, the people he's ruined. Ask him what happens to anyone who threatens his precious empire. She's trying to make me doubt him, Tasha realized, reading the woman's intentions. But her thoughts are full of lies and manipulation. I don't need to ask him anything, Tasha said, stepping closer to Charles. I can see the truth. The truth? Ottilie laughed coldly. The truth is that you're a convenient distraction, a pretty little project to make him feel human again. But when he gets bored, and he will get bored, you'll be discarded like yesterday's news. That's what I'm counting on. Once she's gone, he'll realize what he lost. You're wrong, Tasha said firmly. And you're leaving. Now. I don't think so, Ottilie said, but her confidence wavered when she saw the way Charles was looking at her with complete contempt. Security, Charles said into his phone. I need an escort for Ms. Fairchild. She's no longer welcome in this building. You can't do this to me, Ottilie said, her composure cracking. I know things about you, Charles, things that could destroy your reputation. Riggs will pay well for information about his weaknesses. Together we can bring down his empire. Threats now? Charles asked, his voice dangerously soft. You're even more pathetic than I remembered. Security arrived and escorted a protesting Ottilie from the office. But her venomous thoughts lingered in Tasha's mind, along with one particularly disturbing detail. She was working with someone named Riggs to destroy Charles's company. She's planning something, Tasha said once they were alone. She's working with someone called Riggs to hurt you. Charles's expression hardened. Riggs Ashworth, my biggest business rival. I should have known he'd stoop to using Ottilie. This is dangerous, Tasha said. If they're working together, they can't hurt me, Charles said, but his tone lacked conviction. My company is solid, my reputation intact. Your reputation maybe, but what about your heart? Tasha asked softly. Charles, I won't be the reason you get hurt. You're not the reason, he said, moving closer. You're the reason I finally have something worth fighting for. The sincerity in his voice made her chest tighten with emotion. I'm scared, she admitted, of my abilities, of these feelings, of what people like Ottilie might do to us. Then let me protect you, Charles said, taking her hands in his. Let me be the shield you need while you learn to shield yourself. And what do I give you in return? Hope, he said simply. For the first time in 15 years, you give me hope that I might be capable of love, of being loved in return. The vulnerability in his voice broke down her last defenses. Without thinking, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but when he responded by pulling her closer, it deepened into something desperate and hungry and full of 10 years' worth of longing. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. This changes everything, Tasha whispered. Good, Charles said, his forehead resting against hers. I want everything to change. But as they stood there in the aftermath of their first kiss, neither of them noticed the photographer with the telephoto lens in the building across the street, or the way their intimate moment was being captured for purposes that would soon threaten everything they were building together. The war for Charles Stockard's heart had just begun, and Tasha was about to discover that loving a billionaire meant becoming a target for everyone who wanted to destroy him. But for now, in this moment, with his arms around her and his mind blessedly silent against hers, she felt safe enough to believe that their love might be worth any price they'd have to pay. Chapter 6. The Heart's Deepest Secrets. The Stockard Technologies Charity Gala was the social event of the season, and Tasha felt like an imposter standing in the glittering ballroom wearing a designer gown that cost more than her rent. 2 months had passed since she'd started working at Stockard Technologies, and the professional relationship they'd tried to maintain was slowly evolving into something deeper. Charles had been patient, respectful, giving her space to process her abilities and her feelings. But the attraction between them was undeniable, growing stronger with each passing day. Tonight was different. Tonight, she was attending as his date, not his employee. Tonight, they were finally acknowledging what had been building between them for weeks. "You look stunning," Charles said, appearing at her side with 2 glasses of champagne. The way his eyes traveled over her emerald silk dress made her skin flush with warmth. "Thank you," she replied, accepting the glass with slightly trembling fingers. "I have to admit, I'm nervous. This is our first official date." "You don't need to be nervous," Charles said, his voice gentle. "We've been getting to know each other for months now. This is just making it official." "Making what official exactly?" Tasha asked, studying his face. "What are we, Charles? What do you want us to be?" "I want us to be whatever feels right," he said, taking her hand. "I want to explore this connection between us, see where it leads. I want to stop pretending that what I feel for you is just professional admiration. And I want to stop pretending that I'm not falling for you," Tasha admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Despite everything, the complicated beginning, the telepathy, the media attention, I'm falling for you." Wonder how much he's paying her. She's obviously after his money. He could do so much better. She's beautiful, but there's something strange about her. The way she observes people, like she's seeing more than she should. "Is that the girl from the accident? The one who's been mentioned in the business journals?" The constant stream of judgment and speculation made Tasha's head pound, but Charles's presence kept the voices manageable. She'd learned to use him as an anchor, focusing on the peaceful silence of his mind to block out the chaos of everyone else's. "The reporters are here," she said, noting the photographers positioned around the room. "Are you sure you want to be seen with me publicly?" "I want to be seen with you everywhere," Charles said, his voice low and intimate. "I'm tired of hiding how I feel about you." Before she could respond, a commotion near the entrance caught their attention. Riggs Ashworth had arrived, and he wasn't alone. Ottilie Fairchild clung to his arm, her smile predatory as she surveyed the room. Time to destroy the great Charles Stockard, starting with his little pet. Tasha gasped at the venom in Ottilie's thoughts, but it was Riggs's mental voice that made her blood run cold. "The evidence is all gathered, financial records, witness statements, proof of his illegal business practices. By tomorrow morning, Stockard will be finished." "Charles," she said urgently, "we need to talk, privately." He must have heard the panic in her voice because he immediately guided her toward a quiet alcove away from the crowd. "What is it?" "Riggs and Ottilie. They're planning to destroy you. Tonight. They have evidence, financial records, something about illegal business practices." Charles's face went pale. "That's impossible. My company is completely legitimate." "They're going to fabricate evidence," Tasha said, reading the surface thoughts of their enemies across the room. "They're planning to leak it to the media tomorrow. They want to destroy your reputation and your company." "Why are you telling me this?" Charles asked suddenly, his voice strange. How do I know you're not part of their plan? The question hit her like a physical blow. What? You show up in my life at the exact moment my enemies are planning to destroy me. You have unexplained abilities that let you read minds. How do I know this isn't an elaborate setup? He doesn't trust me, Tasha realized with growing horror. After everything we've shared, he still doesn't trust me. You think I'm working with them? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know what to think, Charles said, but his eyes were cold, distant. I've been betrayed before by people I trusted, people I loved. Charles, please, don't! He stepped back from her, and without his presence to shield her, the thoughts of everyone in the ballroom crashed through her mind like a tsunami. I need time to think. He walked away, leaving her alone in the alcove with the overwhelming noise of hundreds of minds pressing against her consciousness. The elegant ballroom suddenly felt like a prison, the glittering guests like predators circling their prey. She looks like she's in pain. What's wrong with her? Is she having some kind of breakdown? Charles just left her standing there. Trouble in paradise. Tasha pressed her hands to her temples, trying to block out the voices, but without Charles's calming presence, her abilities were spiraling out of control. She could hear everyone's thoughts, feel their emotions, sense their secrets and desires and fears. Having trouble, dear? Ottilie's voice cut through the mental chaos like a blade. You look positively ill. Perfect. She's losing control. Everyone can see she's unstable. Get away from me, Tasha managed through gritted teeth. Oh, but I'm just getting started, Ottilie said, her smile vicious. Did you really think you could steal Charles from me? A nobody like you. The photographers are getting perfect shots. Tomorrow, the headlines will read, Stockard's mysterious girlfriend's public breakdown. You planned this, Tasha said, realization dawning. You knew my abilities would be overwhelming in a crowd like this. I planned to show everyone what you really are, Ottilie replied. An unstable woman who shouldn't be anywhere near a man like Charles. The camera flashes were blinding now, and Tasha could feel herself losing the battle against the mental noise. But then, through the chaos, she heard a familiar voice. Tasha, where are you? I can sense you're in distress. Dr. Blackthorne. He was here, probably as a guest, and somehow he was trying to reach her telepathically. The realization that she could receive thoughts as well as hear them gave her a surge of hope. I'm in the main ballroom, she thought back. I can't control it. Too many people. Focus on my voice. Let me guide you out. Following Dr. Blackthorne's mental guidance, Tasha managed to push through the crowd toward the exit. But as she reached the doorway, she heard Charles's voice behind her. Tasha, wait! She turned to find him standing there, his face full of regret. I'm sorry. I was wrong to doubt you. When I saw you in pain, when I realized what Ottilie was doing to you, you realized I was telling the truth, she said, hurt still raw in her voice. I realized I was a fool, he said, stepping closer. I let my past betrayals cloud my judgment. I let fear make me doubt the one person who's been trying to protect me. He's sincere, she realized, seeing the truth in his eyes. He's genuinely sorry. Charles, we need to deal with Riggs and Ottilie. They're about to... I know, he said. While you were fighting off that mental attack, I was making phone calls. My security team is already investigating their claims. Whatever evidence they think they have, we'll prove it's fabricated. But what if they've already damaged your reputation? Then we'll rebuild it, he said simply. Together. The word together made her heart skip. Charles, I love you, he said, the words coming out in a rush. I've loved you for 10 years, and I almost lost you tonight because I was too afraid to trust it. I won't make that mistake again." "I love you too," she said, the confession feeling like a weight lifting from her chest. "I think I've been falling for you since the moment I woke up in that hospital and found you there." He pulled her into his arms, and the moment their lips met, the world outside ceased to exist. The kiss was desperate, hungry, full of 10 years of longing and the promise of forever. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Let's go home," Charles said, his voice rough with emotion. "Your home or mine?" she asked. "Our home," he said, and the possessive way he said it made her knees weak. "I want to wake up next to you every morning for the rest of my life." As they left the gala together, neither of them noticed the photographer who had captured their reconciliation, or the way their kiss would be splashed across tomorrow's front pages with headlines that would change everything. The war for Charles Stockard's heart was far from over, but tonight, love had won the first battle. And as they drove through the city lights toward their future together, Tasha finally understood that some love stories were worth fighting for, no matter how dangerous the fight might be. The woman who could read minds had finally found the man whose heart was strong enough to love her through anything. Their greatest challenges still lay ahead, but together they were ready to face whatever came next. Chapter 7. Love Under Siege. The headlines hit like a coordinated attack at dawn. Stockard's mystery woman, mentally unstable or gold digger, and Billionaire's breakdown. Inside Charles Stockard's dangerous romance. Tasha stared at her phone in Charles's penthouse bedroom, watching her life implode in real time. The photos from the gala were everywhere. Her moment of mental overwhelm, Charles walking away, their passionate reconciliation. But the captions told a twisted story of manipulation and instability. "It's worse than we thought," Charles said, emerging from his office with a grim expression. "Riggs didn't just fabricate evidence about my business practices. He's launched a full media campaign, questioning my judgment, my mental state, my fitness to run a company. The stress is affecting him more than he's letting on," Tasha realized, watching the tension in his shoulders. "He's terrified of losing everything he's built." "What about the evidence? Can your lawyers prove it's fake?" "They're working on it, but damage control takes time. By then the board might vote to remove me as CEO." His voice was carefully controlled, but she could see the fear in his eyes. "Riggs played this perfectly. He's attacking both my professional reputation and my personal life." Tasha's phone buzzed with another notification. The story was spreading across social media, with hashtags like #Stockard scandal and #Mind Reader mystery trending worldwide. Someone had leaked details about her hospital stay, her alleged telepathic abilities, even her financial struggles. "They're destroying you because of me," she said, her voice breaking. "If I hadn't been at that gala, if I hadn't lost control—" "Stop!" Charles crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. "This isn't your fault. Riggs and Ottilie have been planning this for months. They would have found another way to attack." "But I made it easy for them," Tasha said, tears streaming down her face. "I should leave, disappear, give you a chance to rebuild without the woman I love?" Charles's voice was fierce. "Never. We face this together, or we don't face it at all." Before she could respond, his phone rang. The caller ID showed his grandmother's name, and Charles's entire body went rigid. "Eloise," he answered, his voice carefully neutral. "She's furious," Tasha sensed, even though she couldn't hear the older woman's thoughts directly. "She's been fielding calls all morning about the scandal." "Yes, I've seen the headlines," Charles said. "No, I'm not going to end things with Tasha, because I love her, and she's done nothing wrong. I don't care what the board thinks." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Charles's responses growing increasingly terse. When he finally hung up, his face was pale. "She wants to meet with you," he said quietly. "Today. She says the family needs to understand what they're dealing with." "She thinks I'm a liability," Tasha said, "not really a question." "She thinks you're an unknown variable in a very dangerous game," Charles corrected. "But Eloise Ravencroft has been the power behind the Stockard family for 60 years. If anyone can help us weather this storm, it's her." An hour later, they sat in the elegant drawing room of the Stockard family estate, facing a woman whose steel-grey eyes missed nothing. Eloise Ravencroft was 83 years old, impeccably dressed, and radiated the kind of authority that came from decades of wielding power behind the scenes. "So," she said, her voice crisp and precise, "you're the young woman who's captured my grandson's heart and nearly destroyed his empire in the process." "Grandmother," Charles began, but Eloise held up a hand. "Let her speak for herself, Charles. I want to hear what she has to say." Tasha took a deep breath, knowing that this moment could determine everything. "Mrs. Ravencroft, I love your grandson. I didn't seek him out, didn't plan to disrupt his life, but I won't apologize for loving him, and I won't run away just because his enemies are using me as a weapon against him." "Admirable," Eloise said, "but love isn't enough to protect an empire. Tell me about these abilities you supposedly possess." "She's testing me," Tasha realized. "She wants to know if I'm delusional or if there's something more to this story." "I can read minds," Tasha said simply. "It started after my car accident. The brain trauma created new neural pathways, and now I can hear people's thoughts. Right now, you're wondering if I'm telling the truth or if I'm cleverly manipulating the conversation." Eloise's eyebrows rose slightly. "What else am I thinking?" "You're thinking that Charles looks happier than you've seen him in years, but you're terrified that happiness will cost him everything he's worked for. You're also thinking that I'm either the best thing that ever happened to him or the worst mistake he's ever made." "Impressive," Eloise said, "though it could be educated guesswork." "You're also thinking about your late husband, wondering what he would have done in this situation. You're remembering how he once told you that the greatest risk in life is not taking any risks at all." The silence that followed was deafening. Eloise stared at Tasha for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You really can read minds," she said finally. "I really can," Tasha confirmed, "and I know how impossible it sounds, how it makes me seem like either a fraud or a freak. But it's real. And it's part of who I am now." "And you can't read Charles's thoughts?" His mind is completely silent to me. It's the only peace I get from the constant noise of everyone else's consciousness." Eloise looked at her grandson, then back at Tasha. "Do you know why that might be?" "I have a theory," Tasha said quietly. "I think it's because his feelings for me are so deep, so protected, that they exist in a place my abilities can't reach. Love that's strong creates its own kind of barrier. Or," Eloise said thoughtfully, "it's because you're meant to be together. Sometimes the universe has a way of protecting what's precious." Charles reached for Tasha's hand, and she felt the familiar sense of calm that came with his touch. "Grandmother, what do we do about Riggs and Ottilie?" "We fight," Eloise said firmly. "The Stockard family has survived scandals before. We'll survive this one too. But first, we need to control the narrative." "How?" "By telling the truth," Eloise said. "All of it. Your love story, Tasha's abilities, the decade of devotion that led to this moment. We make it a love story so compelling that the public forgets about the scandal." "That's risky," Charles said. "If people don't believe her—" "Then we prove it," Eloise said simply. "We demonstrate her abilities publicly, under controlled conditions. We show the world that she's not unstable or manipulative. She's extraordinary." "Absolutely not," Charles said, his voice hard. "I won't let her become a circus act." "Charles, It might be the only way, Tasha said softly. If we can prove that my abilities are real, that I'm not some con artist. The risks are too great, he insisted. What if something goes wrong? What if you lose control like you did at the gala? Then we'll deal with it, Tasha said firmly. Together. Like we promised. Eloise smiled for the first time since they'd arrived. I like her, Charles. She has spine. She has everything, Charles said, his voice filled with love and fear in equal measure. Which is why I can't bear the thought of losing her. You won't lose me, Tasha said, bringing his hand to her lips. Whatever happens, we face it together. As they sat in the elegant drawing room, planning their counterattack against enemies who would stop at nothing to destroy them, none of them realized that their conversation was being recorded. Hidden cameras, planted by Riggs's security team, were capturing every word, every plan, every vulnerability. The war for Charles Stockard's heart was about to enter its most dangerous phase, and their enemies were already 3 steps ahead. But love had made them strong, and together they would find a way to survive whatever came next. The woman who could read minds and the man who had loved her from the shadows were about to face their greatest test, and their love would either save them or destroy them both. Chapter 8. The Power of Truth. The live television interview was scheduled for prime time, and Tasha had never been more terrified. Remember, Dr. Blackthorne said as makeup artists worked on her face, don't try to read everyone at once. Focus on one person at a time and describe exactly what you're experiencing. The more specific you are, the more believable it becomes. Charles paced behind the cameras like a caged panther, his anxiety radiating through the studio. They'd decided to do this interview together, a united front against the media storm that had consumed their lives for the past week. 30 seconds, the director called. I can't do this, Tasha whispered, panic clawing at her chest. What if I freeze up? What if I can't control it? Charles was beside her in an instant, taking her hands in his. You're the strongest person I know. You survived a car accident, brain trauma, and the awakening of impossible abilities. You can handle a television interview. But what if they don't believe me? Then we'll deal with that too, he said firmly. But Tasha, I need you to know something. Even if this destroys my company, even if I lose everything, I regret nothing. Loving you is the best thing I've ever done. Before she could respond, the cameras rolled. Good evening, I'm Janet Morrison, and tonight we have an exclusive interview with billionaire Charles Stockard and the woman at the center of a media firestorm, Tasha Ertel, who claims to have developed telepathic abilities after a car accident. She thinks this is all nonsense, Tasha realized, reading the host's thoughts. She's here for the ratings, not the truth. Ms. Ertel, Janet continued, you've been accused of manipulating Mr. Stockard through elaborate psychological tricks. How do you respond to those allegations? I respond by demonstrating that my abilities are real, Tasha said, her voice steadier than she felt. You're thinking that this interview is nonsense, that I'm either delusional or a very skilled con artist. You're also thinking about your daughter's recital tomorrow night and hoping this interview ends on time. Janet's professional mask slipped for just a moment. That's a lucky guess. She's also thinking about your divorce proceedings and whether your ex-husband will try to use this interview to question your credibility as a journalist, Tasha continued. And you're remembering a conversation you had with your producer this morning about creating compelling television regardless of the truth. The color drained from Janet's face. How could you possibly know that? Because I can hear your thoughts, Tasha said simply. Just like I can hear the thoughts of everyone in this studio right now. She turned to address the camera directly. The cameraman behind camera 2 is thinking about his sick mother. The sound engineer is worried about his mortgage payment. The makeup artist is wondering if she left her coffee pot on this morning. Murmurs rippled through the studio as each person confirmed the accuracy of her statements. "This is incredible," Janet said, her skepticism crumbling. "But how do we know this isn't an elaborate setup?" "Because," Charles said, speaking for the first time, "I'm going to let her prove it using me." "Charles, no," Tasha said, alarmed. "If I try to read your thoughts, you won't be able to," he said confidently. "You've told me dozens of times that my mind is silent to you. Let's show them why." He reached out and took her hand, and Tasha felt the familiar calm that came with his touch. "Try to read my thoughts," he said softly. Tasha closed her eyes and focused on Charles's mind, pushing against the barriers that had always protected his thoughts from her. For a moment, there was nothing, the same peaceful silence she'd come to associate with him. But then something extraordinary happened. The walls around Charles's mind didn't just crack, they dissolved completely. And suddenly, she was flooded with not just his current thoughts, but with 3 years of carefully guarded emotions. "The first time I saw your design submission, I knew I was looking at something special. Not just talent, but a soul that understood beauty and pain in equal measure. Every piece you created made me fall deeper in love with the woman behind the art. When I learned about your struggles, I couldn't stand by and watch you suffer for lack of opportunity. I was terrified to approach you, terrified that my feelings were one-sided, terrified that I'd ruin your life by being in it. When I saw you in that hospital bed, I realized I'd rather have one moment of truth with you than a lifetime of loving you from the shadows. I love you more than my next breath, and I'd give up everything I've built just to see you smile." The intensity of his emotions, 3 years of carefully guarded love, hit her like a physical blow. She gasped, tears streaming down her face, and nearly lost her grip on his hand. "What are you experiencing?" Janet asked breathlessly. "Love," Tasha whispered, her voice broken with emotion. 3 years of love. He's been protecting me, supporting my career, falling deeper in love with me through my art. He's been terrified to tell me because he thought his feelings were inappropriate, that I was too good for him." Charles's own eyes were filled with tears. "I never intended for you to see that. I built those walls specifically to protect you from the intensity of what I feel." "Why can those walls come down now?" Janet asked, clearly fascinated despite herself. "Because," Charles said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "love is stronger than fear. When our connection is threatened, when she needs to reach me, nothing can keep us apart." "This is extraordinary," Janet said, her professional composure completely abandoned. "Mr. Stockard, is this really the first time she's been able to read your thoughts?" "Yes," Charles said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I've spent years building mental barriers to protect both of us from the intensity of what I feel, but apparently love finds a way through any defense. And the accusations that Ms. Ertel is manipulating you." "Look at me," Charles said, turning to face the camera. "I'm a billionaire CEO. I've built an empire through careful analysis and strategic thinking. Do I look like a man who could be easily manipulated?" "You look like a man in love," Janet said softly. "I am a man in love," Charles confirmed. "I've been in love with Tasha for 3 years, and I'll be in love with her for the rest of my life. Anyone who tries to use that against me will discover that there's nothing more dangerous than a man protecting the woman he loves." The interview continued for another 20 minutes, with Tasha demonstrating her abilities on various crew members, while Charles told the story of their decade-long connection. By the end, even the most skeptical viewers would have to admit that something extraordinary was happening. But as they left the studio, Tasha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Something's wrong," she said, pressing her hand to her temple. I can sense danger, anger. Someone is planning something terrible. Riggs, Charles said grimly. He's probably furious that we managed to turn public opinion in our favor. Charles, I think... Her words were cut off as the world exploded around them. The car bomb had been planted by professionals, timed to detonate just as they reached the vehicle. The blast threw them both to the ground, Charles's body shielding hers as debris rained down around them. Tasha! Charles's voice was desperate, and she could feel blood on her face, taste it in her mouth. Stay with me. I'm okay, she managed, though her head was spinning and her vision was blurred. Are you hurt? I'm fine, he said, but she could see the gash on his forehead, the way he was favoring his left arm. We need to get out of here, now. As sirens wailed in the distance and chaos erupted around them, Tasha realized that the interview had been a trap. Riggs and Ottilie had wanted them in a public place, vulnerable and exposed. They'd turned their moment of triumph into an assassination attempt. This isn't over, she said, gripping Charles's hand as paramedics rushed toward them. They're going to keep coming until they destroy us. Then we'll be ready for them, Charles said, his voice hard with determination. But first, we survive this. Together. As they were loaded into the ambulance, Tasha caught a glimpse of Riggs Ashworth in the crowd of onlookers. He was smiling, and his thoughts were crystal clear even through her pain. Phase 1 complete. Phase 2 begins now. The war for their love had just become a fight for their lives, and their enemies were more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. But they'd survived the first attack, and their love was stronger than ever. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The woman who could read minds and the man who had loved her from the shadows were about to discover that some loves are worth dying for, and some are worth killing for. Chapter 9. Fighting for Forever. The hospital room was becoming all too familiar, but this time Charles refused to leave Tasha's side even for a moment. She'd been unconscious for 3 days since the car bomb explosion, her brain struggling to process the trauma on top of her existing telepathic abilities. The doctors said the combination of physical injury and mental strain had sent her into a protective coma. Her neural activity is unlike anything we've documented, Dr. Blackthorne explained, studying the monitors. The telepathic pathways are in overdrive, as if her mind is trying to process every thought in the city at once. Charles gripped her hand tighter, his own injuries forgotten. The gash on his forehead had been stitched, his broken ribs were healing, but none of that mattered. All that mattered was the woman lying motionless in the hospital bed, her face pale against the white pillows. "Can you reach her?" he asked desperately. "Through your connection?" "I've been trying for hours," Dr. Blackthorne said, "but her mind is locked down completely. She's protecting herself from telepathic overload." Charles leaned closer to the bed, his voice barely a whisper. "Tasha, I need you to come back to me. I know the world is too loud, too chaotic, but I'm here. Find my voice in the darkness and follow it home." The monitors continued their steady beeping, but there was no response. "Do you remember what you told me about Sanctuary?" Charles continued, his voice growing stronger. "You said my mind was like shelter in a storm. Well, I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Let me be your shelter now." Still nothing. "I have something to tell you," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. "Something I've been carrying around for weeks, waiting for the right moment. But I realize now that there's no perfect moment. There's only now, and the love we share." He pulled out a small velvet box, his hand steady despite the gravity of the situation. The diamond ring caught the hospital lights, throwing tiny rainbows across the ceiling. "I love you, Tasha Ertel," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "I've loved you for 3 years, and I want to love you for the rest of my life. I want to marry you, build a life with you, protect you from everyone who wants to hurt you. But I need you to wake up first. I need you to fight whatever battle you're fighting in there and come back to me." As he placed the ring on her finger, something miraculous happened. The chaotic readings on her monitors began to slow, the frantic neural activity settling into more normal patterns. Color returned to her cheeks and her breathing deepened. Slowly, Tasha's eyes fluttered open. "Charles?" Her voice was barely audible, but it was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. "I'm here," he said, bringing her hand to his lips. "I'm right here." "I could hear you," she whispered. "In the chaos, through all the noise, I could hear your voice calling me back. You were my anchor in the storm." "How do you feel?" "Like I've been through hell and back," she said, managing a weak smile. "But the voices, they're different now. Quieter, more manageable. Like my mind finally learned how to build proper walls." Dr. Blackthorne rushed in, alerted by the change in her vital signs. "Tasha, welcome back. How are you feeling? Any disorientation? Pain?" "I'm okay," she said, though her voice was still weak. "Better than okay, actually. Something's changed. The telepathy is still there, but it's controlled now, like my brain finally figured out how to regulate the input. The trauma may have actually helped your mind develop better coping mechanisms," Dr. Blackthorne said, amazed. "It's as if your consciousness learned to create natural barriers during the coma. Or maybe," Charles said softly, "love finally found a way to protect you." Tasha looked down at her hand and gasped when she saw the ring. "Charles, is this a proposal?" he said, his voice filled with hope and vulnerability. "I know the timing isn't perfect. I know we're in the middle of a crisis, but I can't wait anymore. I need you to know that whatever happens, I want to spend the rest of my life with you." "Yes," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, of course, yes." He kissed her then, gentle and reverent, and she felt the last of her mental barriers settle into place. The world was still full of thoughts and voices, but now they were background noise instead of overwhelming chaos. "I love you," she said against his lips. "I love you so much." "I love you too," he replied, "and I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving it to you. And I'm going to protect you from everyone who wants to hurt you." "We're going to protect each other," she corrected. "That's what partners do." Before Charles could respond, the door burst open and Bryce rushed in, his face a mixture of relief and fury. "Thank God you're okay," he said, hugging his sister carefully. "When I heard about the bombing—" "I'm fine," Tasha assured him, "but Riggs is still out there. He's not going to stop." "Actually," Bryce said, his detective smile grim and satisfied, "he is going to stop. We arrested him 3 hours ago at a private airfield trying to flee the country." "What?" Charles sat up straighter. "How?" "Your company's security footage from the bombing led us to his location. We also found extensive evidence of the fabricated financial records, the bribes he paid to journalists, even recorded conversations of him planning the attack." Bryce's expression was triumphant. "He's facing federal terrorism charges. He won't see freedom for decades." "And Attili?" Tasha asked. "Turned state's evidence in exchange for a reduced sentence. Apparently, she was more afraid of prison than she was loyal to Riggs." Charles felt a weight lift from his chest. "It's over?" "The criminal charges, yes," Bryce said. "But you'll need to rebuild your reputation, your company." "We'll rebuild it together," Tasha said firmly, squeezing Charles's hand. "All of it." "Are you sure?" Charles asked. "Being with me means being in the public eye, dealing with media scrutiny, facing people who will always question your abilities." "I'm sure," she said without hesitation. "I've spent my whole life feeling like I didn't belong anywhere. With you, I belong everywhere. Even when the world thinks you're crazy." "Especially then," she said, smiling. "Crazy in love is the best kind of crazy." Charles laughed, the sound filled with joy and relief. "In that case, Mrs. Stockard-to-be, what do you say we get out of here and start planning our wedding?" "I say yes to everything," she replied. "To the wedding, to the life we're going to build, to facing whatever comes next, as long as we're together." As they prepared to leave the hospital, Tasha felt a sense of peace she'd never experienced before. Her abilities were still there, but they were manageable now. The love she shared with Charles had given her the strength to master them instead of being mastered by them. "One more thing," Charles said as they walked toward the exit. "I have a wedding gift for you." "Charles, you don't need to." "I bought the gallery," he said simply. "The one where I first saw you 10 years ago. I thought we could turn it into a foundation for young artists, give them the opportunities I helped create for you." Tasha stopped walking and stared at him. "You bought an entire gallery as a wedding gift." "I bought it as a promise," he said. "A promise that I'll spend the rest of my life making sure your dreams come true." She kissed him then, in the middle of the hospital corridor, not caring who saw or what they thought. This was her life now, loving a man who had loved her for 10 years, using her extraordinary abilities to help others, building something beautiful from the ashes of everything they'd survived. "I love you, Charles Stockard," she said against his lips. "I love you too, Tasha Ertel," he replied. "Forever and always." The woman who could read minds and the man who had loved her from the shadows were finally ready to step into the light together. Their greatest adventure was just beginning, and nothing would ever be the same. But for the first time in both their lives, different felt like exactly where they belonged. Chapter 10. Perfect Love, Perfect Life. 1 year later, the garden at the Stockard estate was transformed into a fairy tale. White roses and baby's breath adorned every surface, their fragrance mingling with the warm summer air. String lights hung from ancient oak trees, creating a canopy of stars above the assembled guests. The setting sun painted everything in shades of gold and pink, as if the universe itself was celebrating their love. Tasha stood at the edge of the garden, her hand resting on her rounded belly, watching the final preparations. At 6 months pregnant, she glowed with happiness and the kind of contentment that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. "Are you ready, my dear?" Eloise Ravencroft appeared beside her, elegant in silver silk, her eyes soft with genuine affection. "I've been ready for this moment since the day I met him," Tasha said, adjusting her flowing ivory gown. "I just never knew it would feel this perfect." "He's been pacing in the study for an hour," Eloise said with a knowing smile. "I've never seen him so nervous or so happy." "He's been nervous about everything since we found out about the baby," Tasha laughed. "Yesterday he rearranged the entire nursery because he was worried the crib wasn't positioned for optimal morning light. That's love, dear, the beautiful, overwhelming, slightly irrational kind that makes life worth living." Through the French doors, Tasha could see their guests taking their seats. Dr. Blackthorne was there, beaming with pride at her progress. Apollo Stockard, Charles's younger brother, was serving as best man. Isaiah Nightfall, her best friend and maid of honor, was making last-minute adjustments to the floral arrangements. But it was Bryce who approached her now, looking handsome in his dark suit, his eyes suspiciously bright. "You look radiant, little sister," he said, offering her his arm. "Are you sure you're ready to marry a billionaire?" "I'm ready to marry the man I love," she corrected. "The billions are just a bonus." "Good answer," he said with a grin, "because here we go." The music began, a string quartet playing the piece Charles had commissioned just for her, based on the colors and emotions of her favorite painting. As they walked down the rose-petal-strewn aisle, Tasha felt the familiar whisper of thoughts from their guests. "She's absolutely radiant. They're perfect together. Look how happy Charles is." That baby is going to be so loved. But all of that faded to background noise when she saw Charles waiting for her at the altar. He was devastatingly handsome in his black tuxedo, but it was the expression on his face that took her breath away. Pure love, wonder, and gratitude, as if he couldn't believe this moment was real. When Bryce placed her hand in Charles's, she felt the familiar calm that came with his touch. Even after all this time, he was still her safe harbor in the storm of human consciousness. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "So are you," she whispered back. "Are you ready for this?" "I've been ready for this since the moment I saw your work," he said, squeezing her hand. "You've been my dream long before I knew you were also my destiny." The ceremony was simple, but profound. They'd written their own vows, and when Charles spoke, his words were filled with 3 years of love and a lifetime of commitment. "Tasha, you saved me from a life of isolation and emptiness. Through your art, you showed me what it meant to feel again. Through your love, you taught me what it meant to be human. You gave me hope when I thought I was beyond redemption, and you gave me a future when I thought I had none. I promise to love you, protect you, and stand by you through whatever extraordinary adventures life has in store for us. I promise to be worthy of the gift of your love, today and always." Tasha's vows were equally heartfelt. "Charles, you loved me before I knew how to love myself. You saw my potential when I couldn't see it, and you supported my dreams when I was too afraid to chase them. You showed me that some love stories are worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth believing in even when they seem impossible. I promise to love you with all my heart, to build a life with you that's worthy of the love you've shown me, and to never stop believing in the magic we create together." When they exchanged rings, the diamond on her finger caught the setting sun and threw rainbows across the garden. It was the same ring he'd given her in the hospital, but now it meant something different, not just a promise of love, but a celebration of everything they'd overcome together. "By the power vested in me by the state of New York," the minister said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Charles cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears of joy on her cheeks. "I love you, Mrs. Stockard." "I love you too, Mr. Stockard," she replied, and then they were kissing, and the world exploded in cheers and applause and the kind of happiness that makes everything else disappear. The reception was magical. They danced under the stars, Charles' hand protective over her growing belly, their guests celebrating around them. The speeches were heartfelt, the food was exquisite, and the love in the air was almost tangible. "No regrets?" Charles asked as they swayed to their song. "Only one," Tasha said, smiling up at him. "I regret that it took a car accident for us to find each other." "I don't," he said firmly. "Everything that happened, everything we went through, led us to this moment. Our love story isn't perfect, but it's ours, and I wouldn't change a single chapter. Even the telepathy, the media circus, the bombing. Especially those things," he said, spinning her gently. "They proved that our love is stronger than anything the world can throw at us." As the evening wound down and their guests began to leave, Tasha found herself standing in the garden where they'd been married, Charles's arms around her from behind, his hands resting on their unborn child. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "The future," she said, leaning back against his chest. "Our daughter, the life we're going to build, the love we're going to share with her." "She's going to be extraordinary," Charles said, his voice full of wonder. "With your artistic soul and my determination, she'll be unstoppable." "She's going to be loved," Tasha corrected. "Completely, unconditionally, perfectly loved. That's all that matters." "Celeste Aurora Stockard," Charles said, trying out the name they'd chosen. "Our little star." "She's going to be perfect," Tasha agreed, "just like this moment." just like this life we've built together. 3 months later, at 3:47 a.m. on a snowy December morning, Celeste Aurora Stockard entered the world with a cry that sounded like music and eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. Tasha held her daughter for the first time, overwhelmed by the tsunami of love that crashed through her heart. Charles sat beside them on the hospital bed, his face wet with tears of joy, his finger gently stroking their daughter's tiny hand. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "Absolutely perfect." "She's ours," Tasha said, marveling at this beautiful creature they'd created together. "Our little miracle." "Our greatest masterpiece," Charles agreed, and in that moment, surrounded by the golden light of dawn and the profound peace of new love, their story reached its perfect conclusion. The woman who could read minds had found the man whose heart was vast enough to love her through anything. Together, they had created something beautiful, not just a child, but a legacy of love that would echo through generations. In the years that followed, they would face new challenges, new adventures, new joys. Tasha would learn to use her abilities to help others, founding a research institute for extraordinary mental phenomena. Charles would rebuild his empire stronger than ever, with Tasha as his true partner in every sense of the word. But it all began here, in this moment, with a car accident in a thunderstorm that changed everything. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories start with the most unexpected beginnings, and sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most unlikely packages. Love had found a way, as it always does, to transform tragedy into triumph, loneliness into connection, and two broken hearts into one perfect whole. The woman who could read minds and the man who had loved her through her art were finally, truly, completely home. And their story, their beautiful, complicated, perfectly imperfect love story, would be told for generations to come, a reminder that some loves are strong enough to survive anything, overcome everything, and create miracles that last forever. The end.